Well, what started all of this was a constitutional court ruling which said the way that the new regulations around procurement had been made was illegal. It didn't strike down the regulations, it struck down the way they'd been created. The organisation that took the regulations to court and won this, you could argue started all of this, was the business group Sakeliga. Its CEO is Piet Roux. Piet, good afternoon to you and thank you for your time. The Finance Minister has said today it's not true that black economic empowerment regulations no longer apply. You've suggested that they do no longer apply. How do you react to what the Finance Minister said today?
Well, the fact is that for the first time in many years, government's preferential procurement regulations omit all reference to black economic empowerment and local content. And that means that the perception is no longer there because it was unlawful, that the Treasury can prescribe BEE and local content requirements for state-owned entities, municipalities and so on. And that is a very remarkable change in the dynamic of procurement in South Africa. BEE is a much larger concept and applies even in competition law or in some forms of licensing. There are private sector issues, you have affirmative action, employment equity, all of that. We've challenged a subset, and successfully the Constitutional Court agreed with us that it's unlawful for the Minister to prescribe that. And this removal, for the first time, makes it clear that state-owned entities do not have to require BEE and local content, and that is a very important change in procurement dynamics in South Africa.
Does it mean that SOEs are responsible for a huge, vast chunk of our economic activity, that if they want to implement these regulations, they still could? Or does it stop them from doing that?
Well, they have an option to, under the Constitution, to do two kinds of procurement. The first is normal value for money procurement, and the Constitution is very clear that it should be cost-effective, transparent, and so on. Then they have the option to apply preferential procurement. And for a very limited number of points, as prescribed in the Preferential Procurement Policy Framework Act, for either 10% or 20% of points, they can use some categories of preference. But still the Constitution is clear that it must be cost-effective, transparent, and so on and so on. So the scope is much more limited than was the case. And the problem with the previous regulations that was found unlawful was that it created an impression that there can even be pre-qualification, out-of-hand disqualification of tenderers based on their BEE or local content status. That is all gone now, and we have returned to very limited possibility for the application of BEE and local content in state procurement, and that is very good. And I must commend also Minister Godongwana in his briefing, where he acknowledged the important findings of the Zondo report, which said that the state procurement officials should be advised that the primary objective of state procurement is value for money. We wholeheartedly agree with that sentiment, and what's happened now takes us in that direction, and it was, of course, spurred on by Sakeliga's court case earlier this year and 5 years of litigation.
Does it not only take us, as you put it, in this direction, but for a short period of time? They can still, government, maybe not just the finance minister, but the government can draft new regulations, right?
It's possible, but the regulations and any new changes, even because there's a new procurement bill in the works, first, that will take some time. Estimates today in Treasury's briefing was that in excess of a year at least to get that done. But even then, it is still bound to the Constitution. Again, as Mr. Godongwana acknowledged in that very same briefing, no act can go beyond what the Constitution says. And in Section 2171, it's clear that procurement should be cost-effective and so on, value for money basically. And then there is an option to supplement that with preferential procurement, but not to the detriment of the value for money objective in the Constitution. So it is actually quite limited, and they would need a constitutional change to open the door to the kind of preferential procurement that we saw unlawfully for the past 5 years. It would require a constitutional change. Not going to happen soon.
What impact do you believe all of this is going to have on our economy and on businesses now?
I think from the perspective of the person on the street in South Africa who suffer an ailing economy, who've seen violent unrests, who have to deal with poverty, and even if they have means, operate in an economy that is challenged and hamstrung by maladministration and state failure, especially in towns across the country. This will mean that there is a possibility for many state-owned entities to move away from the very expensive kind of procurement and get back to value for money. And we will see an improvement. And I'll tell you why. Because not only in municipalities not under ANC management, but also within them and within state-owned entities, we have seen just this year more than 700 requests for exemptions from the pre-qualification or the preferential procurement regulations. State-owned entities in South Africa already require exemptions, and now we've made it easier for them to get out of this straitjacket. And this goes as high up as Eskom's under iterator, and it goes as high up as we can prove with documents that we've obtained from Treasury with a buyer request, even as Mr. Gwedimantash, when he wants to procure or set regulations for the procurement of independent power production. So there is a need, and I think that need will be seized on. So it will mean an improvement in the lives of the general person in South Africa. It's in the public interest.
Okay, you say that, and I sort of accept some of what you say, but is it also not true that, as you put it, the average person in the street, most people in South Africa, are black? And what this means is that black businesses who have less capital than white businesses will no longer be able to compete. To put it another way, will it also not re-entrench racialized inequality?
Stephen, the world's not as simple as that. It's not a case that everybody who's white has capital and money and everybody who's black does not. But even beyond that, the purpose of all procurement should be the benefit to the public. And if we make that secondary to something else, then we must ask, what is the budget for that? And Stephen, so the question that I would pose in the case of that question from you to me that I could pose to you is, what is your budget for the benefit of some intermediaries? Because that budget is going to come out of the goods and services and the quality and the cost for the general public. There's a trade-off, and that trade-off cannot be escaped. We can only pay intermediaries for local content or BEE additionally if we take that from the public, the benefit they will receive. And I don't think that's a trade-off. That's real business. Real business means the business person is at risk, not the person who must receive the goods and services.
I don't know if that trade-off is necessarily the case, Piet, because what you're suggesting is that black businesses are generally as soon as you say there's a trade-off, it would mean that black businesses have to be more expensive than white businesses. And I don't know if that's necessarily the case. I would also argue, if I was going to argue against you, that it is surely the case that government has a role to do something, to intervene in the economy on racialized inequality. To put it all another way, the unemployment rate for white people in South Africa is well under 10%, and the unemployment for black people is over 35%. Surely government can't allow that to continue, would go the argument.
You're quite right, Stephen, that there's definitely no necessary relationship between the race of a person and the goods and services that company or person can deliver. And that means that as long as that's the case, there is no trade-off, and it would be completely acceptable to award such a tender to that entity, black-owned entity or of any other race. So, Stephen, when there is no trade-off, it's completely acceptable, constitutionally speaking, to do procurement. I could only agree with you. When there's no trade-off, it's completely acceptable to do so.
Do you think that this is going to be the end of the story, Peter? Are you expecting a lot more court action? This is an incredibly contested area, and I understand why. I mean, people's lives and careers, the lives of their children rest on it, of every race in some way. Are you expecting there to be more court action, or do you think that there is some way that maybe everyone can finally agree and work on it? And I don't know if that's possible, because it literally is about the economy in this way.
Stephen, I think we're making progress. 10 years ago, it was very hard to say that there's a problem with BEE. It was very hard to discuss this in public, and now it's common cause. I mean, it's, of course, Sakeliga saying this, but you can go to Molitsi and Beki or Andre de Ruyter, or as we'll release in documents later this week, you can look at what Mr. Gwedimantash has submitted himself to Treasury. And you can just look at the 700 exemption requests from state-owned entities to Treasury for exemption. It tells us that there is a problem. And this problem is now widely acknowledged. So this is a very positive step. Saying that, I also acknowledge that it is a difficult conversation to have and will remain a difficult one. Also because personal interests are involved, and also because political issues are involved. But our challenge will be to make the personal interest secondary to the public interest. And it's going to require a lot of dialogue, and it's going to require a lot of building trust, and it's going to be difficult, because what I'm saying now is that BEE is harmful. It's wonderful to have many other people, including black people, saying that, and including people in government saying that, and including state-owned entities asking for exemptions. So it's becoming an easier conversation, but I acknowledge that it is difficult. And precisely because there will always be this kind of suspicion that it is for sectional interest that one does this litigation. But look, Stephen, BEE and preferential procurement and local content is undoubtedly harmful. It has been very, very harmful. And there are cases in which it wasn't harmful. But in the majority of cases in South Africa, it certainly has cost the public. And we must not make that the secondary interest. We must remember what was our purpose. It was serving the public interest.
Piet, thank you. The CEO of the organization Sakeliga.